There's a moment that happens in meetings, in classrooms, in group chats, in ordinary conversations between friends, where someone says something you don't agree with, and a small, quiet decision has to get made almost instantly. Do you speak up, or do you let it go? For a lot of people learning English, that decision carries an extra layer of weight, one native speakers rarely have to think about consciously. Because in your first language, disagreement probably has its own carefully calibrated shape, its own softness, its own unspoken rules about how directly you're allowed to contradict someone, depending on who they are, how well you know them, whether they're older than you, whether they outrank you at work. And when that internal shape gets translated word for word into English, something strange and uncomfortable tends to happen. The sentence that felt perfectly polite in your head somehow lands out loud in English, sounding blunt, almost aggressive, sometimes even a little cold. You say, "No, that's wrong," meaning something closer to, "I see this a little differently," and the room shifts slightly. A small silence, a raised eyebrow. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would call out directly. But you feel it anyway, that faint sense that something in the delivery didn't land the way it was meant to. And so, gradually, a lot of learners make a quiet, understandable choice. They simply stop disagreeing out loud at all. They nod along in meetings where they actually see a real problem with the plan. They type, "Sounds good," in a group chat when it very much does not sound good. They let genuinely useful pushback die quietly in their own head, because the alternative, saying it directly, in English, felt like a much bigger risk than staying silent. Here's the reassurance worth starting with. Nothing is wrong with your instincts, and nothing is wrong with your English. What's actually happening is something worth understanding clearly, because once you see it, an entire category of anxious moments starts losing its grip. Every language carries disagreement differently, wrapped in its own particular texture of politeness, directness, hedging, and tone. And translating disagreement word for word from one language into another almost never survives the trip intact. Because what gets lost isn't vocabulary, it's cushioning. English, especially in casual and professional contexts across most English-speaking cultures, relies heavily on a layer of verbal softening around disagreement, small linguistic buffers that don't change your actual opinion at all, but change how directly that opinion collides with the other person's. Strip that cushioning away, translate too literally, and even a completely reasonable, well-intentioned disagreement can land with far more force than you ever meant to deliver. So the real skill here isn't learning to disagree less. Disagreement, expressed clearly, is often exactly what a good conversation, a good team, a good relationship actually needs. The real skill is learning where English builds in its cushioning, and how to use that cushioning naturally, so your actual point still lands clearly, just without the accidental sharpness of a too direct translation. Let's start with the softening techniques themselves, because there's a small learnable toolkit here. And once it's genuinely internalized, it becomes almost automatic. The first technique is what you might think of as the partial agreement opener. Before disagreement arrives, English speakers very often acknowledge some sliver of validity in the other person's point first, even a small one, before pivoting into their own view. "I see what you mean, but..." That's a fair point, although. "I hear you," and at the same time. Notice that none of these openers actually concede the argument. They simply signal, before the disagreement lands, that you were actually listening, that the other person's view registered with you before you moved past it. This single small habit does an enormous amount of quiet work, because disagreement that arrives after acknowledgement feels collaborative. Disagreement that arrives with no acknowledgement at all, straight into a flat no, feels like a wall going up. The second technique involves softening the certainty of your own claim, rather than the disagreement itself. Instead of stating your opposing view as flat, unquestionable fact, English speakers frequently frame it as their own perspective, explicitly. "I might be wrong, but..." From what I've seen, it seems more like, "My take on this is a little different. This isn't false modesty, and it isn't weakness. It's a subtle but important shift, from 'I am right and you are wrong,' toward 'here is another way of seeing this.' Which one of us happens to be right doesn't need settling in this exact sentence." Ironically, this kind of framing often makes people more receptive to your actual point, not less, because it doesn't force them into an immediate defensive corner. The third technique is using a question instead of a direct statement, particularly when you suspect there might be a flaw in someone's plan or reasoning. Rather than saying, "That won't work," try, "Have we thought about what happens if," or "What would happen if we tried it this way instead?" This isn't about hiding your opinion behind a question as some kind of trick. It's a genuinely different rhetorical move, one that invites the other person into examining the problem alongside you, rather than positioning you as someone standing outside their idea, tearing it down from a distance. The fourth technique is one of the simplest, and also one of the most commonly skipped by direct translation. Softening modifiers. Small words that don't change meaning but noticeably change tone. Kind of. A little. Maybe. Perhaps. I think. It seems like. Compare for a moment, this is a problem, against this might be a bit of a problem, or I think there could be an issue here. The underlying concern is identical in both versions. The emotional temperature is not. Native English speakers use these small words constantly, almost unconsciously, threading them through disagreement, requests, and criticism alike, precisely because they lower the intensity of a statement without weakening its actual content. Let's put these together because theory only goes so far without seeing the shape of a real exchange. Picture a small team meeting. Someone proposes launching a new feature next week, ahead of the usual testing timeline, eager to move fast. The direct translation instinct, the one that feels natural if you're mentally translating from a more blunt disagreement style, might come out something like, "No, that's too risky. We shouldn't do that. Technically accurate." Almost certainly going to land harder than intended, especially delivered flatly, in a group setting, in front of other people. Now listen to the same underlying concern, softened using the exact techniques just covered. I get why we want to move fast on this, and I think there might be a bit of a risk if we skip the testing phase. What if we did a smaller rollout first, just to catch anything unexpected, before going fully live, notice everything that happened in that single response? There's acknowledgement first, I get why we want to move fast. There's a softened claim, I think there might be a bit of a risk, rather than a flat, unqualified, this is risky. There's a modifier doing quiet work, a bit of. And there's a question offering an alternative, rather than simply shutting the original idea down outright. The actual substance of the disagreement hasn't changed even slightly. This person still believes the plan is too risky as written, but the delivery invites collaboration instead of triggering defensiveness. And that difference alone often determines whether a genuinely good, protective piece of pushback actually gets heard or gets quietly resented and dismissed. Try one more scenario, this time more personal. A friend suggests a restaurant for dinner that you tried once and didn't particularly enjoy. Translated too directly, the instinct might come out as, "No, I don't like that place. Let's go somewhere else," softened. Using the same underlying toolkit, it might sound more like, "I've actually been there before, and it wasn't really my favorite. Would you be up for trying somewhere else instead?" Same honest opinion, completely different emotional weight landing on the other person. It's worth pausing here, because there's an important boundary worth naming clearly. None of this is about becoming vague, indecisive, or afraid to hold a real position. Over-softening carries its own genuine cost. If every single sentence gets buried under 5 stacked qualifiers, kind of maybe I think, perhaps sort of all piled into one exhausted sentence, the actual point can disappear entirely underneath the cushioning meant to protect it. The goal isn't maximum softness, it's calibration, matching the amount of cushioning to the actual social stakes of the moment. A casual disagreement about a restaurant choice with a close friend needs relatively little softening. A disagreement with your manager, in a meeting, about a decision that could genuinely go wrong, deserves careful, deliberate framing, precisely because more is riding on how it lands. There's also a quieter, deeper piece worth sitting with here, one that goes beyond specific phrases entirely. A huge amount of what makes disagreement feel safe or unsafe in any language isn't really about the words chosen at all. It's about tone, pacing, and whether the other person senses genuine curiosity behind your pushback or something closer to a verdict already decided before the conversation even began. Two people can use identical softening phrases, and one will still come across warmer than the other, purely through pacing, through a slightly gentler tone, through a pause that signals real thought rather than rehearsed politeness. Learning the phrases is the necessary first step. But underneath the phrases, what actually reassures people is the sense that you're genuinely willing to hear more, not simply performing softness while your mind is already closed. So here's something small and useful to actually try. The next time disagreement rises up somewhere in your day, whether that's a meeting, a group chat, or a conversation with a friend about something as low stakes as where to eat dinner. Before the disagreement itself, reach first for a small acknowledgement. "I see what you mean," or "That makes sense, but..." Then soften your own claim slightly, rather than stating it as flat, unquestionable fact. I think, or it seems like, or from what I've noticed. And if it fits the moment, consider turning your objection into a genuine question rather than a closed statement, inviting the other person to think alongside you, rather than simply receiving your verdict. None of this asks you to hide what you actually think, or to agree with things you don't believe. It asks you to deliver your honest opinion, in a shape that English speakers instinctively recognize as collaborative rather than combative, so that the actual substance of what you're saying, the part that matters, the part that might genuinely help, finally gets the chance to be heard clearly, instead of getting lost behind an accidentally sharp edge that was never really the point in the first place.